Hello, hello, and welcome to Florida Basketball Hour. I am Neil Blackman, Saturday Down South. On this episode, Eric Fawcett, Gator Country, BurnerBall.com, and myself going to break down a couple of big Gator wins at home. Florida routes South Carolina, Florida routes Oklahoma. Neither game was particularly competitive. The South Carolina game was a little more competitive, I think, as a product really of the matchup that South Carolina presents for Florida. But the Gators are just better than both those teams. Cruise to victory without Alex Condon. Florida has not lost a game when Elijah Martin was out, Alex Condon out, Walter Clayton out. Just keep winning. 5 straight now that they've rattled off since that tough one at Tennessee. They're about to head on the road to play LSU in Georgia. Could be a little trickier in both of those games for reasons that we'll discuss. But right now, Florida ranked number 2 in the country for the first time in 10 years. They're that high in the poll. Of course, the last team to be ranked that high was the 2014 Final Four team. And in fact, Florida received the number 2 ranking 10 years to the day that team was ranked number 2 in the polls. So, goes without saying, just a incredible honor. It's one of those things Fawcett and I have been talking about forever is no one cares. Not no one. People that cover the sport don't care about polls. We kind of just laugh at the AP poll, really. But like the attention around the program, because Florida's been in the top 25 poll the entire season, has been massive. And yeah, I mean, they're 23-3. They were picked to finish 6th in the SEC, so clearly they have exceeded expectations. And just another dominant win on Tuesday night against the Sooners. And that was an interesting one because, like, Jeremiah Fierce had a really good game, and the game never really felt competitive. So just kind of a little bit of a testament to what Florida's doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, really, it felt like this was like a program win. Like it was one where Florida just felt like so much more talented at every position. Like you said, Jeremiah Fears really good. Was impressed the game he had. While like I thought he didn't even play that well relative to how he can play, and was still very, very good. But just one of those things that you're like, wow, the Gators have, and Florida staff and Todd Golden have allocated their resources, of which there are many, but they've allocated them well. They've obviously won some evaluation battles with a Hauk, with a Condon. Obviously, Condon didn't play, but it's just a situation where, like, yeah, you could be without a Condon, who I really would argue has been and I guess we haven't really talked about this. Like, I really think he's been the second best skater this year. If I had to say, I think a lot of people would have Elijah Martin. You could probably make a Will Richard argument. I do think it's been Condon. So I'll say they're missing their second best player, and still the depth to go out and dominate a team like that. And again, to some extent, we almost have to like reset our expectations of what a bottom SEC team is. Just in the sense of, like, if you even look 2 years back, the team that was in 14th place, or sorry, if you were to look, see, I forgot there's less teams in the league. So obviously right now, Oklahoma is in 14th in the SEC. If you were to look last year and say who is 14th in the SEC, that team was 145th in KenPom. If you were to look 2 years ago and say who was in 14th, that team's 151st in KenPom. If you look the year prior to that and look at the team that was 14th in the SEC in KenPom, that team was 219th. Oklahoma's 50th. So on one end, you could, like, that's what's like really, again, is crazy. And I think people talk about a lot about the top of the SEC and, the middle of the SEC, why the league is so good. Like, it is crazy that you like, if you just said on paper, the Gators, who are one of the best teams in the SEC, absolutely whopped a team that was 14th in the SEC by a million, you'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Now, if you took that standings out of the picture and you said Florida just absolutely dominated a team that's 50th in KenPom, you'd be like, oh, that's pretty good. That's like usually like the 7th or 6th best team or maybe not that, but like, the ninth or 10th best team in the league, or the eighth best team. So, yeah, it's one of those things you have to remind yourself, like, yeah, it wasn't just that Florida just dominated a team in the basement of the SC. They dominated a team that was 50th in KenPom. They did it with their depth. They have guys like, after already Thomas Houck being one of the best players off the bench in the SEC, obviously starting now. Denzel Aberdeen's had stretches as one of the best players off the bench in the SEC. And then now it's like Urban Klobzar can come in as a guy who had a lot of DNPs and knock down a bunch of threes. Like, yeah, that's what just really struck me about this win, where they just completely overwhelmed Oklahoma, is they were missing a top player and just felt like the most talented team at every single position, 1 to 9. And again, really like Jeremiah Fears, but if you put he's their best player against, or more, you put those top two against Walter Clayton, and Florida still has the edge there. So yeah, this was like a program win to me by the Gators.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I was saying right before Eric joined a couple minutes late, and I was saying, like, I think
apologies.
No, it's all good. Florida had 5. They had 5. They've rattled off 5 games in a row that they've won since the Tennessee kind of debacle, and someone's been missing in every game. Like Walter Clayton out for Vanderbilt. They overwhelmed Vanderbilt with their depth in the second half. Elijah Martin misses the Auburn game of all things. And like, quite honestly, and Eric and I have talked about how, like, if you were going to have no Elijah Martin for like one super high profile, really great team, I honestly would pick Auburn. And the only reason I say that is because, like, their guards, like, there's no one that you really say, I need Elijah Martin to go stop that guy on Auburn. Whereas, like, even with Duke and just Tyrese Proctor's kind of ability to get downhill, like, I'd want Elijah Martin. That's kind of I understand that that's a little contrarian, but I'm really being like Alabama. Like, you would not want to not have Elijah Martin against Alabama. So, like, was it fortunate? Sure. Did Florida also do something that no one has done this year and not many teams have done the last few years, and just take it to Auburn in the jungle? Yes. They didn't have Martin. Martin misses another game. Miss State. We've seen that Miss State is pretty good this week. They've reminded us of that. Florida loses Condon 30 seconds into the game, loses Martin, wins. So lots of program stuff going on for the Gators. And like, one point I have continued to make, and I know Eric has made it at Gator Country and elsewhere, is like, these were, like Eric just mentioned, evaluation wins. Like, a lot of this was that, because the reality is, like, Florida benefits from continuity more than a lot of teams in the portal era. Certainly most of these guys played together last year, with the exception of, they added Rubin and they added Chinyelu, who are kind of the impactful guys. Obviously, Klavzar's coming on. But the point is, like, the core, you had that Clayton, Richard, Howe, Khan, and all those guys had kind of been together. That's considered good continuity in the year of our Lord 2025. But Tommy Houck had his first Power 6 offer. It's now the Power 5. Then it was the Power 6. First Power 6 offer was Florida. Condon, 3 Division I offers. I think Houck ended up with 4. His mom told me 4 Power 5 offers. And Illinois offered late, and they didn't even believe that Brad Underwood wanted him. It was just like Northwestern and Florida had offered. So, like, they were like, yeah, sure. So, like, Houck was a huge evaluation victory, right? They won an immense recruiting battle with Rick Pitino to get Walter Clayton back home. And they had all these structural advantages, but they still had to convince him that playing for this staff was the right thing for him, and not playing for who Eric and I think are in agreement is the best college basketball coach in the sport, maybe ever, in Rick Pitino. And by the way, like, St. John's is awesome. And the one problem they have right now is they don't have an advantage creator offensively who can, like, make it harder to guard them. So the fact that Walter Clayton isn't at St. John's is probably why St. John's isn't number 2 in the country. He's at Florida. So these were wins that, because I've seen some takes start to come out, and they're from like the usual suspects in the Florida fan base, to be honest. They're like, well, they should be this good. Look at the roster they have. Like the second five would make the NCAA tournament. And I just wonder sometimes if people have any idea how competitive sports work. And like, maybe I do mean that in a mean way, which would be unusual for me, I guess. But like, this was a really, really well put together roster by this staff. Jonathan Sapphire, as the director of analytics, I think is kind of a Florida's GM. And in a way, like, Florida was ahead of the curve a little bit, which I know is probably really weird for a lot of Florida fans to hear because of the football situation. And it's something I've mentioned. I was on radio in Atlanta, and I was saying, I think Florida, by appointing a director of analytics and scouting, when people weren't doing that, they were adding support staff for development and other positions. Or, somebody should pay Fawcett to do this kind of job because he'd be awesome at it. And the reality is, like, Florida was ahead of the curve, and Jonathan Sapphire is really good at his job. And so Florida kind of and I'm not giving Jonathan all the credit. I'm just saying, like, clearly this staff did a really great job putting together this roster, and the dividends are playing themselves out on the floor, which is why, in my last plug, before I kick it back to Eric, you got to go to patreon.com/Florida BB Hour and dive into what makes the Gators good. Film studies, analytical stuff, SEC power rankings, because the SEC is awesome. I just dropped a batch of those about 30 minutes ago. But player film studies, game previews, all of it's there. And there's memberships starting at $2 a month that have a lot of the content. Most of the video stuff is in the $3 or $5 tiers. All the stuff is in the $5 tier. We appreciate all of you that's supporting. And you should know that most everything on the pod is going to be Patreon related, like first, once March Madness starts. And it's not because we don't care about the podcast. It's because it's just easier for us from a time management standpoint to be able to kind of log into the Patreon and record on our own. So, like, yeah, we're going to rally and come together and do shows as the tournaments go on. But the easier thing for us to do is to put Patreon and all that stuff up. So go over there and subscribe. And maybe Eric can dive back in with some thoughts on kind of roster construction, because it was an elite roster build. I don't, that's not even debatable at this point.
I mean, okay, here's the funny counter to what you just said. I don't think Elijah Martin has been as good as people expected him to be. Ruben Chinyelu has been solid. They still had to pay up for him, and there's a lot of other centers they could have got. And Sam Alexis is looks like an all-out miss. And again, we'll see down the line. But this is why I say it's a program win, is because they didn't do all that well in the portal this year, and they're still one of the best teams in the country. That's what I think is incredible. Is I would say Alexis looks to be an all-out miss. I would say Chinyelu is a B, which is whatever, solid. There's still guys in that price range I would have preferred. And then, Martin, relative to what it cost to get him, I would say that was a B. And again, I know some people are going to debate this, and that's totally fair. But this was not a all-out win of a portal class, and they're still amazing because Condon, they hit out of the park, A++ from an evaluation standpoint. Hauk, A++ from an evaluation standpoint. Will Richard's an interesting one because they went through a year and some of him being solid, but not, we saw what the first year looked like when he was a starter. And that's nothing against him. He can't control the position he's put himself into by the staff. But Florida made a longer term investment with that one, and maybe that's Sam Alexis. But you could still argue that has gone, that's obviously gone fairly well. Denzel Aberdeen looks like that was a good pickup. So it's Florida's wins in the past have made it to the point where they are so good right now and can kind of absorb. And again, everyone knows, I'm not trying to hide it. I had the Gators lower than 6th in my preseason rankings. Everyone saw our prediction show, and people listen to the podcast knows I did not think this team would be anywhere near what they are right now. So I'm not trying to hide from that. I'll be honest. But like one of the big reasons why is because I thought Elijah Martin isn't as good as people think. Ruben Chinielu's not as good as people think. And Sam Alexis isn't good enough to be a high level starter. And all of those things I think are true. Yet they're still infinitely better than I expected. So that's why I think like what is so incredible is so many good evaluations and good allocation of resources means that they can absorb a portal class that is not that pivotal to what they're doing right now. If you eliminated all three guys from the portal class from the roster, I think the team might still be in the same position they're in. So yeah, and again, so people might be like just completely disagreeing with everything I'm talking about. But and man, like it's even interesting when you look back at some of these guys, like and again, if you want to do this and you want to subscribe to the Patreon, you can go back and watch videos from wherever. So you can go a year and a half back and look at the video that I did of Alex Condon when he was playing in the NBL one, like essentially like a summer league that goes from like really good NBL Australian players trying to stay in shape to like semi-pro players. It's one of the most bizarre leagues in the world. And watching Alex Condon, I was like, yeah, I'm not sure this guy is like, I don't know if he's got it. Like, it's going to be a long-term kind of thing with him. And like, I go back and I look at that and I'm like, I still like believe in what I saw. Like again, and I can go back and look at it. So it's one of those things that as much as I also always like to say like, oh, development is overrated in college basketball. Like I can tell you, I put in the time to look at what he was doing in the NBL one, and he has gotten much better in the year and a half from then. So yeah, all that's just really why I say program win, because I think when you look at a lot of teams that are successful in college basketball, you look at what they did this year in the portal or high school recruiting, and you can say, hey, they brought in these really talented players this year and they're playing well. And that is just not the case for Florida at all. It's the players that they brought in 2 years ago that are why they're so good now. So it was 2 years ago making good decisions and being able to retain some of those guys. And that's really the reason why this team is good. And I'd be interested in what people think. I'm sure people vehemently disagree with me and think that Elijah Martin is incredible and Ruben Chinielu is incredible. Not sure I'm going to get too much pushback on the Sam Alexis has not been very good. But yeah, so it's obviously the season has turned into it's had a very different outcome than I expected. And you see a game like this with Oklahoma, and like Neil, you mentioned that the Patreon and the NCAA tournament, and me and Neil had the conversation the other day about like, hey, like what's content going to look like? We're going to be very busy. We also want to really reward the people that have been supporting us by them having first access or exclusive access to a lot of the content we do. So exactly what that looks like, we're unsure. But what I'm really getting at is, while we were talking about what it's going to look like, is we kind of said, well, there's going to be selection Sunday, and then there's going to be a series of, about a week, and then Florida's going to play on Thursday or Friday, and then, and then we started talking about what we're going to do the next week. And it was because we already were like, well, they're obviously going to win the first 2 games. And certainly we're not trying to jinx anything if you're into that, but it's just like when you see the way that Florida has competed with teams like in Oklahoma, they just leave no doubt. And it's just one of those situations where, again, we can argue Florida's ceiling, and I think that will be the conversation we have, because that's the conversation you have when a team is a number 1 seed. Is not, well, do you think that they can beat the 8 or 9 seed? It's like, well, like, do you think that they're going to make an Elite 8, or do you think they can win the national championship? Like, that's the conversations you have with the 1 seed. And we'll talk about that. But we're in a situation where, like, when we're talking about what we're going to do for the Patreon, we're already talking about what we're going to do between the round of 32 and the Sweet 16. And like, again, that might be presumptuous, but you just watch games like this one. You watch games like a Mississippi State. You watch games, like a South Carolina. And you can question the team's ceiling. And to be honest, I think I will, and that might be my next Patreon video. But the one thing that I do think is the chances of them getting upset by a 16 seed right now, or a 15 seed if Florida were to lose a couple games and drop to the 2 line, it just seems completely unfathomable because of the depth and athleticism and pace they play at. And so that was another just reminder these last couple of games where the Gators have had the very favorable schedule going against the bottom teams in the league. Florida just reminding people are like, hey, like, don't worry about us this first week in the NCAA tournament. We're not slipping up against a 9 seed in the second round. At least that's what I'm predicting.
Yeah, I mean, as bad as South Carolina had been, they came into games with a top 50 defense, and Florida scored 1.31 points per possession against them. Like, I mean, like Denzel Aberdeen scored 22 points off the bench, and Eric did a great Patreon video about like why he's been so good. And that's it. Like, part of the roster build was also the program build to the point of program win. And like, so when you hire Corey McRae, who is widely respected as a player developer, right? Like, I don't think Corey is, and I'm sure, look, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but I think that when you talk about Corey McRae and you talk about Carlin Hartman, you're talking about guys that develop players. You're not necessarily talking about somebody who's known for, I'm not saying that they can't scheme anybody up. I'm just saying what they're known for is getting players better. And then they bring in Torian, who, sure, did he play for Billy Donovan? Yeah. Will we expect Billy Donovan to give a glowing recommendation of Torian to anyone? Yeah, but Billy has always held the Florida program in very high esteem. Naturally, he cares about what happens here. And I mean, he was the one who urged them, hey, Torian is really good at this. He's really good at getting players better. And Florida's guards have just across the board improved. Across the board. So it's development wins, it's evaluation wins. And obviously, I mean, you guys know it's well known now, like Fawcett and I aren't totally in alignment on Martin. The point I would make about Elijah Martin is what he's brought from an intangibles perspective, I think, is just extraordinarily hard to kind of evaluate with data. And, I talked to Rick Barnes about him after the Tennessee game, and Rick was just effusive in his praise for Elijah and said, like, look, when you have a player that plays as hard as he does, you either have to match that intensity in practice or he embarrasses you over and over again. And he said, so it's just a cultural thing. Like, you get a kid that plays as hard as him and everybody wants to match his fire. So, that's Rick Barnes. That's not anybody on Florida's staff talking about him. That's an opposing coach. Will Richard has said, like, Elijah Martin has raised the competitiveness in our locker room to heights it hasn't been in. He just, again, like, there really is like a category called play your ass off. It's a Houston Cougars category. And Elijah Martin, like, checks that box for me. And I just think that's the difference. Now, is Eric right? Like, analytically, like, yeah, like, look, his numbers are a little bit better than they were at FAU, and he's in a power league. His offensive rating, a little bit higher. His effective field goal percentage, a little bit higher. His 3-point percentage, a little bit higher. But it's not like the numbers would wow you. And in fact, his defensive win shares are down a little. Now, he's top 10 in the country in that category, but he was top 5 at FAU. So, it's not like what's his defensive impact actually on the court. If you value that statistic, it's about the same as it was at Florida Atlantic. And a little bit of a drop off in a better league, but not much of one. I just think that from a kind of intangibles perspective and cultural perspective, he's been really, really massive. And the other thing I'll say about Elijah Martin, because it's almost March, and I think this is like important. And shout out Terrence Oglesby, if any of you guys listen to Field of 68, because he brought this up, because he was talking about A-Mart the other day. And he said, because somebody said, well, what do you think? Can Florida win 4 in a row or can they win 6 in a row? And John Fanta said, oh, they can win 6 in a row. And somebody else said, oh, I don't know. I think they can win 4 in a row, right? That's the difference between the Final Four and the national title, by the way. And Oglesby said something that was pretty interesting. He said, well, the thing about them is Elijah Martin will be so valuable to them the deeper they get. Like, he's the guy who scored 28 points in the Final Four. Like, he's not going to be wowed by any particular moment. Nothing's going to be super large for him. And Walter Clayton, we all saw in the NCAA tournament last year, like, didn't seem to shirk or shy away from the spotlight at all either. But I do think that's valuable when you get into these big NBA arenas that they play the Sweet 16 in, and everybody's kind of looking around and something bad happens. It sure will be nice to have a guy who was the most outstanding player of an NCAA regional on your team. So shout out to Oglesby for kind of pointing me in that direction and made me look at all those numbers. But I do think that's a valuable thing to think about when we start talking about Florida's ceiling. But for me right now, I wrote this at Saturday Down South today. Like, I think there's 6 teams in the SEC that can win 4 in a row. And I go back and forth. That's can, obviously. Obviously, all 6 can't. But I go back and forth on if there's 1 team or 2 teams that can win 6 in a row. And I'm getting closer on Florida. I need to see how Alex – tell you what they can't do. They cannot win 6 in a row if Alex Condon is not healthy. And you already saw, like, the little tiny chinks in the armor in the last couple games. Like, we talk about program wins. They won by 21 and whatever they beat Oklahoma by, Eric. And if you, like, nitpick, they didn't really do well on the offensive glass in those games. And so, like, how have teams beat LSU? Well, LSU is top 30 in effective field goal percentage defense. Like, their first shot defense is excellent. It just is. They're also 330th in defensive rebounding. So the way you beat LSU is get your misses. Well, Florida might have trouble doing that Saturday. You know? So that's kind of my point. And I think Eric probably has a lot to say about that. But, like, they'll need Alex Condon if they intend to win 6 in a row, which of course they do.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, something that, like, I think it's hilarious, but, so everyone obviously knows that, it comes up on every broadcast that Alex Condon, grew up playing Aussie rules football and wasn't necessarily a basketball player and has somewhat recently, changed to being a basketball guy. I don't know if you heard this, Neil, but, so he rolled his ankle, and in the post game, Todd Golden was like, "Oh, well, he's never rolled an ankle before." And I was like, if that doesn't tell you that he has not played a lot of basketball in his life, I don't like. There's all these stories about, like, how, oh, he started playing at this age. Oh, he was busy playing Aussie rules. There's nothing that told me is like, no, this is not a guy that, like, this is obviously a guy that has not played a lot of basketball. Then saying he just rolled his ankle for the first time in his life as a second year player at the University of Florida. So thought that was that was kind of a funny story. Not obviously don't want to see Alex. Not funny that he rolled his ankle, but
it is an awesome story though.
So something, I mean, you really have perfectly teased something that I very lightly teased. Now I'll just straight up say what I'm going to do for Patreon. Maybe today, but more likely tomorrow. But I was working on this for Gator Country, and I'm going to do it as a Patreon video as well. And it's essentially going to be a look at the reasons why Florida can win a national championship and the reasons why they can't. So I don't want to get into all of them here. That's going to be on Patreon. But I will just point out something about Elijah Martin because you kind of referenced it. But one of the reasons I would say that, and again, it's not meant to be like, I'm not trying to be like, and again, that's why I'm very much putting it like, these are the reasons that Florida can win a title. There's numbers, there's discussion, all that. Then there's like, here's the reasons why they wouldn't. If they fall short, here could be the reasons why. And one of the things is that Florida has very little NCAA tournament experience. Getting guys from the mid-major level, not being successful, particularly the last couple of years, it leads you to a situation where when Florida is going to be hopefully in Sweet 16 and Elite 8 and beyond games, they don't have a lot of guys that have been there. So if you take Elijah Martin out, Florida has played a combined 7 NCAA tournament games. 2 of those belong to Ruben Chinyelu, who was the 4th big in Washington State's rotation. He did not play particularly well in his 8 minutes per game and wasn't, he was an 8-minute a game guy for 2 games. So that's Ruben Chinyelu. And then the other 6 guys are, the returners from last year. Walter Clayton, of course, played really well. Will Richard, I thought, played really well. As a whole, that was not a very good game for the Gators. I would say we can all agree. It actually, you can even look at the final score and it was close. The only reason it was close is because Walter Clayton's generational heater for 2 minutes at the end. This was really a game that the Gators were losing by double digits for most of it, most of the second half. So you just, if you're looking for one of the reasons why, oh man, like why you could have some concern, you could be like, well, there's not a lot of NCAA tournament experience on the team, except for Elijah Martin, who has 6 NCAA tournament games on his own. So talking about the intangibles, that is something that when you look at Florida's 13 combined NCAA tournament caps between everyone, and about half of them belong to Elijah Martin, I do think that is going to be important. Talking about winning in different ways, talking about the quick turnaround, talking about dealing with media, which I know you told a hilarious story about Elijah Martin in media preseason with the University of Florida, which maybe you need to you should tell it again once I'm finished here. But like, because I do think it's hilarious and is relevant. But yeah, so as much as I have been someone who hasn't been as high on what Elijah Martin has done, I still obviously think he's a really good player and think that he could have some huge value in the NCAA tournament, because that is one thing. I mean, Todd Golden, too, in the NCAA tournament. Team played pretty well at San Francisco, but I think a lot of people had them winning that game.
That was such a great game.
That was an awesome game. Perhaps not an indicator of future success. McMahon struggling a little bit. But sorry, just turning off the call. Should have went on Do Not Disturb. But yeah. So I think you should tell your Elijah Martin story again.
Yeah, it was funny. We were at the I don't know if it was the first or second media gathering of the year, but it was right at the beginning of the season, and it might have even been the first one or the official media day one, but in any event, Elijah came in and he spoke after Will Richard, but before Walt, and there were probably at most there were 15 to 20 people at most. It was funny. I texted Eric almost immediately after because I couldn't even believe. So I forget who it was, and even if I remembered, I probably wouldn't say. But someone asked Martin, looked around the room and saw 15 to 20 reporters and was like, "Oh man, you came from FAU. You're probably not used to a media availability with this many reporters at it." And Elijah Martin just kind of looked at him and was like, "I played in the Final Four, so this is this is not as big as that was." And it was just like, clearly some people just, I don't know, they hadn't thought about it. It's also a reminder that for all of Florida's tradition, sometimes there's media that show up and they just have no idea what's going on. But yeah, it was funny. And I do think Elijah can handle that, and yeah, I mean, Eric's right. Like, he has about half the roster's experience. Walt Clayton has played 2 really good games in the NCAA tournament and lost them both, right? I think he had like 15 in the first half against UConn at Iona or something like that. He was very good. Because I remember when Florida was recruiting Walt, I got all these texts. Are they going to land this guy? He's pretty good. And I got a text from somebody, that was involved in that recruitment on the St. John side. And they said, Patino knows how bad he needs this guy. He also knows it's ridiculous that he got him at Iona to begin with. Like, how people miss this kid is ridiculous. And, now I think he's going to be a first-team All-American.
I also realize now in my count, I just I forgot that game against Connecticut. Sorry. So so eight NCAA tournament games for the non Elijah Martin.
It's still a great point.
It's still still a lot of the experience is coming, and again, it's like, you're getting the caps to some of the guys that were bench players on that Florida team, but not guys that necessarily had. It's always different being out there for sure. I mean, you mentioned the All-American point. Like, when you look at, we talk about the numbers, the AP poll. Like, I've always kind of thought that it mattered whether you were in or out. Like, I think just to get in is like the difference between being in or out is pretty big for perception. Then I think the difference between being top 5 and 15th is pretty big. So you can certainly debate where Florida should be exactly. I know that there's one guy who happened to be a Florida grad who was the only person that had not Auburn number one this year and had, or sorry, not this year, this last week he had Florida number one. I mean, we could probably have him on the show, to be honest, to talk about his reasoning. My presumption would be that he would be putting Florida's head-to-head win as the differentiator. I would personally disagree with that methodology, and but whatever it is, I think everyone can kind of agree at this point that Florida is a top 5 or 6 team at the lowest. And to see what Walter Clayton is doing, to see the fact that we kind of debate who Florida's second best player is, and there'd be like a couple good arguments for you could really argue for probably 3 guys in good faith and with some decent arguments. But it's just like Walter Clayton has just unquestionably been the engine to what Florida's doing. The numbers have been really good defensively. Neil, I was actually surprised. Like, this is something I don't think we've mentioned on the show, and I will be honest that I was a little bit stunned when I saw it. In just conference play, Florida is number 2 in defensive efficiency, which certainly surprises me.
I had not seen that.
Yeah, I don't know. Someone listening is probably going to be surprised by this, but I think when you talk about people think about when they watch Florida, it's the pace, it's the spurt ability, it is the offense, and like that is Walter Clayton. Like, I do think he has set the tone from a, I don't, it'd be saying, I guess you could say from a culture standpoint, seems a little cliche in this setting, but like his play style has influenced heavily how the Gators have played, and he is scoring at a very high rate and efficiently. He is it almost seems like his point total doesn't give enough justice to what he's doing, because when Florida has had some difficult moments at the end of games, he's the one who bails them out. When they've had some slower first halves, he's the one that's gone on the run and given the Gators the kind of cushion they have that then they nurse for. Like, I really feel like the impact he's had offensively is greater than even his really good numbers suggest. And to do that for a team that is going to be top 5 or top 6 in anyone's evaluation, I do think he's worthwhile of a first team All-American. I did not have him first team All-American coming into the season. Through non-conference play, I did not have him as a first team All-American. I certainly would have him as a first team All-American now. And after not being, and again, not that this is the official metric of people with the vote, but after not being in Ken Palm's top 10 player of the years for much of the year, he's now 8th. For whatever it's worth. And actually, I mean, this actually is a pretty good metric for who some of the best players are. Not exactly, but I'll just read it off for people. Number 1 is Cooper Flagg. Number 2 is Janai Broom. Number 3 is Braden Smith. Number 4 is Cam Jones. Number 5 is Hunter Dickinson. Number 6 is John Tonje. Number 7 is Trey Kaufman-Renn. Number 8 is Walter Clayton. Number 9 is Javon Small. And number 10 is Zakai Ziegler. If you were to use that as just a starting place to say who you think your All-American should be, to me, would very clearly be Cooper Flagg, Janai Broom, Braden Smith, Cam Jones, and Walter Clayton. I do think that Walter Clayton has had a better year than Trey Kaufman-Renn. John Tonje, man, he has been fantastic for Wisconsin, so maybe there's an argument there. And I would not have Hunter Dickinson over John Tonje or Walter Clayton personally. So again, not that everyone just starts looking at the Ken Palm Player of the Year algorithm and goes from there, but just as a reference point, those are some of the players that Walter Clayton's in the conversation with, and yeah, I think he's in the best 5.
Yeah. I'll get my ballot next week and he'll be on it, which I wouldn't have said at the beginning of the year. But I think, like, to me, there were 3 locks. I've tweeted this out. Like, I felt like Flagg, Broom, Braden Smith, it's not close. Like, they're clearly the best 3 players in the country. And then, like, I'm willing to have debates about Cam Jones, Walter Clayton, Tonje. Really probably just those 3, to be honest. But I feel like Clayton, it just everything he does for his team. Walt isn't great defensively, but he plays defense in the bigger games. I think I think objectively, just eye test, he guards harder when Florida's playing someone good. And then I think, Eric mentioned it, like Florida, and this is great because it gives me the segue to what I want to talk about after this. But Walter Clayton is an advantage creator who makes everyone around him better. He also is like just this dude who can create something out of nothing when a possession is bad. And he negates bad possessions. And like I thought early in the game against Oklahoma, I thought Oklahoma was defending in kind of an interesting way because instead of fully blitzing the ball screen, like they would come up to the ball screen and then Florida would engage in those zoom actions or dribble handoffs. And then they would guard the second action. Like they would chase the guy who got the dribble handoff and then guard the second action. And almost so instead of being able to get to the basket, like Will Richard would get cut off in the paint a bunch. And then Florida would have to reset. And there were just two possessions where it didn't matter. Like Walter Clayton just went in and got a basket. He scored 8 of Florida's first 10 points. Florida kind of weathered a nice start by Oklahoma, and then they were off to the races. That was that. And once Florida starts making shots, like Porter Moser said, part of the reason the Gators are so good is that they can throw it inside, particularly when Condon is back. And then they can make 27-foot jump shots. And so they can space you. And then suddenly the way you defend those ball screens, it becomes tougher, right? Yeah, I mean, so I just think he is a schematic advantage. All those things factor into why he would be on my first-team All-American ballot, and I don't think it's close. What I think is interesting about Florida, and this gets back to some area, and this is like if there's one video to watch, if you subscribe to the Patreon after this show, please go back and watch Eric Fawcett on Urban Klavzar, because there was a possession at the end of the Oklahoma game where I wrote down in my little notes, Florida can win 6 in a row. And the reason I wrote it down was, so Todd Golden commits this analytical foul with about 18 seconds left in the first half. And he was pissed because Walter fouled the wrong guy. So they sent Jeremiah Fears to the line. He wanted to send not Jeremiah Fears to the line because he thought, whatever, I'll get the ball back and they'll have 1.1% if we foul the right guy, and then we'll have the possession and a chance to. So Florida ends up winning this exchange 2-0, but Eric knows what happened. Fears missed the front end of the 1-1 for the second time all season, by the way. And immediately Fears runs to cover up Walt Clayton off the miss. And so Clayton can't get the ball. They've denied him the ball. And Urban Klavzar goes coast to coast into the paint and scores. And it was just like, oh, Florida has multiple advantage creators at the guard position now. And by the way, Urban is starting to hit his threes the way that he was doing in practice. Like they have 5 guards that I think they can play in March that all bring something different and valuable. That's the type of stuff that you do actually win championships with. Not saying they're going to win, just that they're getting better, which, you know, a lot of teams are who they are in February.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy to think, but like, and I was going to ask you, and I feel like I use almost entrapment, but like, but it's almost the same thing. Like, we just talked about why Walter Clayton is really good. I mean, like, the first year player who is, I guess, not a freshman, he's a sophomore by NCAA eligibility rules, still, you know, hilarious because he's got the experience he does. But like I was going to ask you, and you don't have to actually answer. I'll say it hypothetically and then or rhetorically. But I'm like, if Florida's in a key situation where they need a ball handler to navigate a trap, not turn the ball over, you might still trust Klavzar more than Walter Clayton, which again tells you something when you've got like your All-American guard. And I'm not even saying this is a slight to Clayton's moment, but like you've got like an All-American caliber guard, and it still might be your guy that was a DNP a lot of games that you trust with the ball in his hands even more. So of course Klavzar bringing that ball handling, and it's just like fun to watch. It's also because he's so short. Like you just see some of those like behind the dribble through the legs combinations that just like are so quick because he's so short. Yeah, Klavzar also up to 9 for 14 from 3 in SEC play. I think people will love to see that.
Good grief.
Neil, actually, question for you: when do you have to put in your All-American ballot? You know, off the top of your head.
So no, the U.S. Basketball Writers Association sends them out. They'll be out to us on Sunday.
Oh, okay.
and they will not be due, it looks like, until March the 9th.
So I say this because I was shown something today that anyone can go look at right now. But it is the case for Janai Broom to be to be the player of the year in college basketball. And I mean, if you open this website, like, you would think he was running for office. It reads and has the look of like, this guy is running for political office. And there's of course all the cases laid out why he's the best. And that is not, again, people in Florida land listening to this won't maybe know this is a thing, because Florida really hasn't had an All-American caliber player in quite a long time. But something that's trickled down from the NBA, where this happens with really a lot of the awards, where agents will send out different stuff promoting their guy for various awards. I mean, you do see that now in college basketball, where schools will do positioning for their guy to be an All-American or to be Player of the Year. And so you'll see that with, of course, putting up something like this. So there's just this website that is all about Janai Broom. I mean, I remember when Fardaws Aimaq, a Canadian from Texas Tech, was in the mix for some of that. They were sending out maple syrup. So anyways, not to put any extra work on like a Denver Parlors plates or whoever he might assign that type of a task to. But yeah, I mean, you would like to see some kind of promotion or something like this, just to kind of make sure that the general voter, who may not all be the most informed despite having a vote for All-American, just to make sure they know what Walter Clayton is doing. And yeah, so that was just a little bit of a reminder. And anyone can go find this Janai Broom thing. Maybe not suggesting you need exactly that. I personally would like something with a little more spice to it. That's something that looks like a political website for me, if they were to promote Walter Clayton. But yeah, could definitely do something there. And I think people know at this point, I am not someone who is going to really just like stand for the Gators or Gator players at it, for anything really. I can really make a good faith argument why I think that Walter Clayton is an All-American. And we've, of course, laid out some of the reasons why here. So I really do think he has earned this. And I like when players get what they deserve and earn, and would definitely like that for Walter Clayton. But yeah, so check out the Janai Broom website. You'll enjoy it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I am gonna check that out. I have gotten 2 so far, by the way.
Okay.
Of these emails. These are just emails. They aren't like, hey, visit our website. But you would want to know that Texas Tech has sent one out for JT Toppin already.
Oh, that's good, because they were the ones who were on it with Fardaws Aimaq sending.
Yeah, please consider JT Toppin for All-American. And then I just got one this morning for Jacoby Gillespie at Maryland. So, I'm sure that they feel like that's merited based on where Jacoby is in a lot of like advanced metrics, but probably not a player that I'm going to consider for my ballots. But yeah, it's pretty fascinating that like these things do actually come out. And yeah, Eric just sent me the Auburn Johnny Broom thing so that I can look.
You should scan it just for a moment. There's just like this one thing where you open up the page. I know this doesn't play super well in podcast form, but it's just like this fairly white website. And there's nice images, but it's like fairly like white and sterile. And in 4 boxes, it says dominance, recognition, legacy, and impact. And again, it's just like the like legacy and impact things. That's where I'm like, wait, is he running for office in or so anyways, I laugh about it, but I mean, I do think this is what should be doing. And I do think Janai Broom has a great case to be the player of the year in college basketball. So does Cooper Flagg. But so again, I'm certainly not trying to diminish what Auburn is doing or the player here, but yeah, it's just an example. And even Neil, to hear that you've said that about 2 players, it's yeah. And again, maybe it is, those guys would need a little bit more of a push than Walter Clayton. But yeah, I would hope to see Florida doing something along those lines, whether it be some kind of an email blast and could be something a little bit more like a website based thing that even fans could go look at, or it could be something like literally sending out stuff to media members that makes a little more of an impact. But excited to see, man. It's not something that we have in the history of this podcast have not talked a whole bunch about possible All-Americans on the Gators. That is for sure.
No, we really haven't. I think the last time we even had this conversation was probably the first year of the podcast. So, and who knows how many people even listen to that. So,
yes, Sarah in Tampa, and I don't know.
That's it,
else.
man. It wasn't a strong list. Look, yeah, I mean, I will certainly stand for the program a little more than Fawcett by full admission. I think I've engaged in my own personal PR campaign for Elijah Martin for Defensive Player of the Year in the SEC. Even though in my articles I feel like I've been pretty fair, like I've had Meshack winning a bunch. I switched it back to Martin today because Martin was plus 31. Like it was like 12-10 when Martin came in the game the other day. And then it was 46-24 at halftime and he hadn't come off the floor. And I was like, okay. But so anyway, the point is, it's not something I've gotten aggressive with outside of the Elijah Martin thing, but I do think Walter Clayton just absolutely deserves to be a first team All-American. And I asked Todd about it after the game the other day. I said, hey, make the case. Florida's never had a first team consensus All-American, believe it or not. And Todd's answer was like, I shouldn't have to. And I kind of thought, well, you might have to. You might have to, because there's some people that are going to vote for Cam Jones. There's some people in the Northeast who are going to vote for the Wisconsin kid. There's some Big Ten voters that might not vote for Walt, even though he's on a number 2 team in the country and is clearly their best player. So we'll see. Florida now has a tricky 2-game road trip that I wanted to talk about a little bit, just because. Okay, so LSU's won 2 in a row. Cam Carter's playing great basketball for them. Kansas State transfer. He's from Louisiana, went home to Louisiana. Big NIL deal. And he has lived up to everything they're paying him. Like, he's been very good. He's a good defender. He can score. He's been kind of hot from 3 lately. He's also been kind of a streaky shooter, Eric. But he's hard to guard. They don't have a ton of other dudes that are hard to guard. And they don't rebound at all. They have 2 freshmen I really like, Victorious Miller and Robert Miller. Florida's very old, and they haven't been bothered by great freshmen much this season, with the exception of Ian Jackson. I can't see either of those guys really pressing Florida, but LSU will be confident. They've won 2 in a row. And because there's no Condon, Florida's kind of offensive rebounding advantage has not been an advantage the last couple games. So I think that's tricky. And then Georgia, it's kind of like, let's extend the pun. Like, the Final Four is in San Antonio at the Alamo Dome, and like Georgia's NCAA tournament hopes Alamo is like beating Florida at home Tuesday. So like Georgia is just going to throw the kitchen sink at Florida to win that game. And I still don't think Florida will have Alex Condon. Now, I'll know more tomorrow at media availability as to where he is, but my guess is their view of it will be like, the last thing we want to do is put Alex Condon on the floor in a physical road game right off an injury and then have him play Texas A&M the following Saturday. Like, let's just give him the extra rest. So my suspicion is it will be Condonless Florida against Asa Newell and Georgia in a must-win game for the Dogs. Do I think Florida wins both these games? Honestly, 3 weeks ago, I would have told you no. But Florida's been playing so well that I kind of do think they win both these games. Would I be surprised if they drop one of them? No.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you want to read into Todd Golden's post-game press conferences, which I don't want to, I mean, to get asked these questions in this setting is, you don't have to take things with as at 100% face value, but like it was initially where he was like, oh, it'll be a week or 2 for Alex Condon. And then like 4 days later or 3 days later or whatever, he said 10 to 14 days. So like, you could either, that's why I'm like, I don't know if you need to take that as at face value. Like, oh, is it worse than they first thought? Like, no, I don't think. I know some people were reading those quotes were like, oh, he first said a week or 2 and now it's been 4 days and he's saying it could be 2 weeks or a little bit more. And I'm like, I think it's a little bit of like, hey, we're a number one seed right now. We're in no hurry to rush this guy back. And I don't think that they should be. And that's one thing where, so, okay, actually just overall take, looking at a more holistic view of the season. Florida did not play a very good non-conference schedule in terms of difficulty. We know this, we talked about this. In order to make sure that they looked good in the net, Florida played their starters a lot of minutes. And it was going to be interesting to see if that was going to catch up to them. So Elijah Martin has somewhat of an injury. Would, the amount of minutes he played have something to do with it? Don't know for sure. With Walter Clayton getting banged up, is the amount of minutes he played have something to do with it? Can't say for sure. Alex Condon rolling his ankle, nothing to do with that for sure. That was a freak play. We all saw it. But that is one of those things where I did wonder, is it going to kind of come back and bite the Gators that they didn't play a lot of these starters 22 minutes in bye games in the fall? They played them 31. And it was because they were trying to just bludgeon teams and make sure that the metrics were going to be in their favor. And of course, that's what happened. Despite the fact that they didn't put up many resume wins, they were good in the metrics. And a big reason why is because they blasted a bunch of bad teams. And the reason they blasted a lot of these bad teams is they kept their starters on the floor. And a lot of people were like, oh, why didn't they play more Urban Klobzar? We'd like to see him develop. It's because they wanted to hammer teams with their starters. Oh, why didn't they play more Sam Alexis? Because they wanted to hammer. And again, we'll see if this and I mean, there's a lot of ways to go about this. Would Sam Alexis be a better player if they gave him more opportunity to actually play in some of those games, as opposed to just running an 8-man rotation? Maybe, but I mean, that's the decision you make as a coaching staff, and the fact that Florida is so good at the metrics has something to do with that. But I just say that to say Golden has also been very open about the fact that he wants to be the number one team in the country. That would certainly mean winning out here. And of course, Auburn taking some losses, but Florida would certainly have to win out. I am, if he really means that, it's like, well, yeah, you get an Alex Condon back when you think he's good to go. You still keep playing your starters hard. You don't take these games lightly. Personally, if Elijah Martin wanted another game off, if you weren't so sure about Alex Condon, if Walter Clayton feels any tinge of something in his hand, personally, I would sit those guys. You have also seen this. Florida's also in a situation where losing guys has not bothered them all that much this year. So I'm anticipating Condon being out for another 2 or 3 games. I would think 2 at least. Florida is again playing 2 of the teams at the bottom of the SEC. But I am interested to see if Florida, if Golden is like, I want that number one seed. I'm leaving no doubt. The way I can at least control my fate is putting out the best roster I can every single night. Or if he will say, I am a 1 seed, and some people think we can win a national championship. I'm Todd Golden in this scenario, so I think we can win a national championship. I'm going to rest these guys because I don't really care about Georgia, and maybe you care a little bit more about like a South or you care a little bit more about an LSU, just because that one does get into the range of, I guess that would be, I haven't looked at the net. I assume quad 2, but so certainly not a devastating loss. But
yeah, they're both.
Maybe correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's quad 2, quad 1. LSU is still pretty comfortably quad 2.
Right. And Georgia should be not super comfortably quad 1, but quad 1, I would imagine.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, so again, I would, yeah. So, but anyways, it'll be interesting to say, and yeah, but in terms of those games, not a whole lot of certainly specifics. I do think Cam Carter is really good, like you mentioned. Anyone looking for Jalen Reed, he was really good for them at the start of the year, then got injured. That's the former Florida commit. Their backcourt can really score. No one else can score. They've got these 2 potent offensive guards. No one else can put the ball in the bucket for them. And you can also see kind of the alarm bells kind of ringing a little bit with LSU, who has largely had the same starting lineup. But then 2 players that I think you mentioned earlier, you definitely mentioned Victorious Miller. I forgot if the other guy you mentioned was Curtis Givens, another freshman. But those are guys that weren't starters that have started the last 2 games. And again,
Givens
LSU is
Robert Miller, right?
And LSU has won the last 2 games, but like again, is it a schedule thing? they lost 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in a row, and then they won the last two. But the last two are against Oklahoma and South Carolina, who are the other teams that are the worst in the SEC other than them. So much of the SEC this year and the wins and losses and the runs can be attributed to the strength of schedule. That's just the nature of an unbalanced league, and Florida has benefited greatly from that. We can all be honest with that. So we'll see just exactly what LSU is like. I really do kind of like the talent with LSU, but man, they do not play well together. They don't fit well together. Offensively, it's a tough watch. They can guard a little bit, and I think people know what the Mike White team is like at this point. I mean, it's crazy because the SEC is the SEC, that you're still seeing Georgia on the bubble. I just would find it really difficult to justify them being in the tournament. And most people have them on the bubble, but out.
Right.
Yeah, they did not. They did have a nice St. John's win in the non-conference, but other than that, nothing, no meat on the bone. I think their best win other than that was like
Kentucky
97th in Ken Palm. And then yes, they beat Kentucky in league play, but it's like, yeah, everyone's got a million quad one opportunities in the SEC. Winning one of them doesn't personally move the needle for me, but whatever it is, you made a fitting Alamo comment, which is hilarious because my wife is actually currently in San Antonio for work and literally was at the Alamo yesterday. So
that's awesome.
I was reading the Wikipedia article about that, so catching up on my American history for all you, or Texas history, whatever you want to say. Yeah, I to be honest with you, Neil, I think the Florida's going to win 2 games by 15 each, like they've done against these teams early. And I think that they'll be missing players, and it won't matter because that's what they've been doing recently. And that's why, yeah, I don't think we need to do any particularly long discussions about it. I do have one more thing to ask you about. I know we're well past an hour at this point, but I have one more thing to ask you about, unless you've got anything more you want to say on those games.
Well, I was going to bring up, I think Eric makes a good point about Condon, and I would sit him too. And I would point to UConn, like last year, like Donovan Clingan was hurt, and they lost to Creighton, got roughed up in Omaha, which is why, for those of you that watch a lot of hoops, that's part of why Danny Hurley was so saucy when they won there this year, was because they took a lot of crap there last year on free beer night or whatever it was. And dollar beer night. Point is, like they sat Donovan Clingan for multiple games. Danny Hurley said maybe 2 more games than they needed to, just because it was like, get well, like we're good. And with Micah Handlockton back, like I honestly don't think there's any need to play Alex Condon in these next 2 games, even if he was okay to go against Georgia, which I don't think he will be anyway. Now, I'd love to have him against Texas A&M. Just because of the way Buzz plays. Like, I don't want to not have the best rebounder you have, offensive rebounder you have in a game where A&M gets 42% of their misses, and like their one weakness is that they'll actually let you get some of your misses if you can rebound a little bit. Anyway, but we can talk about that down the line. So that was going to be my only point is, yeah, like get everybody well, because they need Condon to reach their goal.
So the last thing I wanted to talk about is going to be somewhat of a hard 180. And some people I think are going to be like, why are you bringing this up right now? And I will tell you the reason why. And like many things that are hard to talk about, the best way to do it is just draw it out for as long as possible, which is what I'll do here. So apologies. I think people can kind of remember last year with the entire coaching carousel, just how quickly things move right after the season. I mean, we hardly, even when Todd Golden was hired, I mean, we hardly could have I hardly wrote about the coaching search because it was done so quickly. I don't even remember if we had a podcast discussing candidates. It happened so quickly.
Yeah, I'd have to look.
It looks like Florida is, again, we talked about it earlier. It looks like we're pretty confident they're going to be a second weekend team or beyond. It looks like they could be playing well into April. Neil, like we've podcasted for, I don't know, 6 years now, 7 years, 5 years, many seasons. We started in the Mike White era. We did not have any concerns about Mike White getting hired away to a different program. Florida is now one of the best teams in the country with a young head coach. North Carolina, in your former neck of the woods, current/former, forget if you've totally moved, your neck of the woods, is rumored to open. Indiana is going to open. Tommy Lloyd at Arizona is rumored in some of the other jobs that could open a job in Arizona that could be enticing. I really know this is not the good time to bring this up, but I just know if we don't talk about it now, we might not have another chance to talk about this. But Neil, Golden is going to get talked about for other jobs this summer, and or sorry, spring. Shortly, while the NCAA tournament is going on and before, Todd Golden is going to be talked about to move on, and that is something that is just going to be very foreign to Florida fans who did not have to worry about Billy Donovan getting poached to another job, at least in college basketball. Really,
Right.
they didn't have to worry about, as much as when they hired Mike White, there was like, oh, this could be the next head coach at Duke. That didn't last too long before people weren't really concerned about Mike White jumping for a bigger job. So this is quite foreign to be thinking about. And again, this is not something we need to do in detail, but I'm just like, if we don't talk about the at least possibility of Golden getting hired to a different job, it just literally might happen without us ever speaking a word of it on the podcast. So I know this is like a horrible time to talk about it. We should just be talking about this number one seed, number two in the country Florida team. But I do think it justifies just a quick couple of minutes here in hour one and beyond. What is your kind of just thoughts on that? If you don't have any, that's fine too. And maybe just bringing it up as a possibility to people is enough. But I do think this is something that should be discussed.
Well, I think it has to. Whenever you have a young staff that builds a roster of this good, and we don't know what the sport's going to look like after the revenue share, but we know that this staff, like I mentioned at the beginning, earlier in the show, like they were kind of ahead of the curve. Like they knew what they wanted to do. They implemented their plan and their process. It's worked. Billy Donovan turned down Kentucky in 2007 and 2009. So Florida fans of an older generation have been through this before. And those were very public declinations, right? Like John Calipari was choice 2, Billy Donovan was choice 1. Worked out pretty well for Kentucky, honestly. Billy Gillespie did not work out as well, but then they came back to Billy 2 years later, and he told him no thanks again. Billy was very happy in Gainesville. His family loved it here. He had won a national title at Florida by the time he turned down Kentucky the first time. He'd also been to 3 Final Fours when he turned them down the first time. So he'd won 2 national titles. And he knew he could win a national championship here. His athletic director was building him a shiny new facility. And anyway, the point is, Kentucky still is a better job objectively, but Billy was happy, got what he wanted, got the money that he wanted. His family was happy. His wife was happy. He stayed. Indiana is one you didn't mention. It's not as good a job as Florida. I was really, speaking of, I mentioned Oglesby twice now because Oglesby was talking about Indiana, and he's like, well, somebody said, what's a better job? And he was like, rattling off the names of better jobs. And somebody said, what about Florida? And he said, oh, Florida's a way better job. And it is. Like, at least if you think recent success matters, like Florida has been a more successful program this century. It's been to multiple Final Fours. It's won national titles. Its NIL situation is stable and good. Its facilities are fine. And it's in a league that's as competitive as the Big Ten. So, I don't think, and if Todd's a warm weather guy, so I don't think Indiana's going to move the needle much. I can't say that about North Carolina or Kansas, right? Like Adidas has more money than God because that program is one of the only ones they spend on. They're going to make sure the money's there. Like if Kansas wants Todd Golden and Todd Golden wants to coach at a blue blood, Florida might have a problem, right? People have asked me, well, has Florida extended Todd? They did very recently, right? That doesn't mean you can't sign a new extension. And if I were Scott Strickland, one reason to sign a new extension would be like to secure a larger buyout. Not that
which is
Todd's
massive right now, at least. Which
it's
is
massive
something
as it is. Yeah, but I mean, make it even bigger.
it actually could be enough to. Yeah, that's true. And I would say at its current point, which I really am fairly confident in the number. I don't have the contract in front of me, and I really don't want to say the wrong one. So while I'm 90% sure I know the exact number, I'm not going to say it on this podcast, and I apologize, but it is large, and to the point that like
right.
it might deter. It's definitely enough that it could deter a team like or a school like in Arizona. Um, but of course, Blue Bud, like you said, if it is Kansas, is what I didn't mention. Um, they might pay whatever it is, and maybe, like you said, Strickland's wise to just try to get more if there was an extension.
Yeah, I mean, like, so I would think with Kansas or North Carolina, those jobs are Kansas and North Carolina. Like I saw a stat about Kansas because everybody loves my 20 wins a season stat. National writers think that stat's amazing. Like Florida is a consistent winning program. Like Goodman, like Jeff Goodman sends a message and is like, that stat is staggering. Like it's wild that we never talk about Florida being this consistently good. And I'm like, yeah, well, they haven't been elite in a while, so you just forget about them. And he's like, yeah, that's true. Florida's an elite team right now. So now people are like, wow, they've won a lot of games. Even under Mike White, they were winning a lot of games. Yeah, you can win at Florida. The recruiting base is fertile. Florida's got 2 top 50 players. They're both from in the state of Florida, and neither of them were like heavily recruited by blue bloods. Like Florida can just go grab them because they're in state, and you know what I mean? Like the infrastructure is here to win and win long term. And Todd's going to keep getting the NIL money he needs from people after this season. That's not going to be a problem for him. So if he likes it here and he wants to stay, I think that he'll stay. But if Kansas or North Carolina come calling, it's going to be hard. If Arizona comes calling and he can go home to his home state, that might be tricky, right? Like you don't know. Another one that we haven't talked about, Gonzaga. Like, do I think Florida is as good a job as Gonzaga? In a lot of ways, I do actually, because
such a hard one to rank, Gonzaga.
Yeah, Gonzaga is such a unique situation. But like, if Mark Few leaves, do they go hire Tommy Lloyd? Like, is that the logical hire for them, or do they say, we're not going to hire Tommy Lloyd? We do like this guy that coached against us from the San Francisco Dons, though. And that's interesting. There's this interview that Mark Few did after Florida hired Golden. They were just asking about the WCC, and it was kind of a flippant off the cuff remark. And Mark Few was like, Todd Golden will be in the Final Four at Florida in 5 years. And people were like, oh, Mark Few's just talking up his league. And maybe he was, but it's interesting that that's the coach he chose, right? Not Mark Pope. So, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I'm tired of getting the DMs and asking me to talk about it. And I'm like, yeah, man, I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, it's one of those
they're,
things that
they're part of the process right now. And I honestly think that conversation is far more interesting to me than people that are tweeting at me about roster building for next year. When I'm just like, if you tell me that Jonathan Sapphire and Todd Golden are going to hit the portal for a guard, I'm feeling pretty good that they'll hit.
Yeah, like it is just like it's so interesting to me, just in the sense that, like, again, I mean, I shouldn't have. I said it somewhat flippantly that Florida fans aren't used to dealing with this, and then of course you mentioned, but I think you went back to like 2009 or something.
I mentioned,
an older generation.
Sorry, like
you're right. So I should say the last 15 years, but it's something that again is, and I hate to be cryptic, but quote unquote behind the scenes is something that's being talked about a little bit more with Golden and again, just it'll be interesting. Of course, we know the news that the story that's been around Golden this year, how much that deters or doesn't deter a school. He of course was cleared. So, but you never know how a school might encounter that. And of course, winning cures all. And if Florida does make a Final Four, it'll be very interesting, and how quickly these schools do end up moving or wants to move on things. All interesting stuff. And it's just a situation where Golden did move, it truly might happen so quickly after Florida's season is done that we could be in a point where it could happen and we didn't even talk about it on the podcast. And I do think it's just it would just feel crazy if we didn't. So yeah, I wanted to mention it again. And Neil, again, you mentioned it a little bit before that of course you are a Floridian who went to the University of Florida, and I'm not. So we're always going to have a little bit of a different relationship to the school and to the program. So I am interested in your thoughts in this. And but I think, to me, if you lose Todd Golden to an Indiana or a North Carolina, particularly a North Carolina or a Kansas, which you mentioned that I didn't mention initially, like, that's one to me that, like, I think you just say, like, hey, you lost out to a blue blood, and that means he had a great run at Florida, and you understand that one. Like, that's one that would not eat me up. And if you're Strickland, I do think, to an extent, if, like, hey, we know what Tony Bennett was asking for when he was looking at the Florida opening, and it was a huge number. Florida, of course, didn't satisfy that. If Golden said, hey, I'm getting offered by one of these blue bloods, I need 10 years at a massive amount of money, I honestly think at some point you do just have to say, hey, I think maybe like I don't think you have to keep Todd Golden at all costs. I think if you're Strickland, you've got to say, okay, I don't think we should lose him to we obviously can't lose him to an Arizona State. That's crazy. And
right.
And I think you look at an Arizona, and I know that that's where he's from, but I think that's one where you've got to say, like, okay, we should be able to make things enticing enough that he doesn't leave for Arizona, even though that's where he's from. I do think it, to some extent, if it is a Kansas or a North Carolina or an IU, you tip your hat and you shake Todd Golden's hand. You say thank you for what you've done, and best of luck. And hey, let's schedule a home and home. That'd be fun. And you go and get someone else. And I'll also say the buyout number is important, because Florida's last two hires were fairly unproven mid-major guys in Mike White and Todd Golden. One of them worked out presumably quite well, and one of them didn't work out so well. If Golden gets hired by one of these schools, Florida is going to get a very big reciprocal buyout number, and there's going to be no reason why Florida should go nibbling on an unproven guy again. I will just say that we're certainly not going to talk about guys. We are not talking about a coach.
Yeah, no, I'm not doing that.
If Golden leaves, absolutely not. But I will just say this: if Florida has this, continues to go on to be a Sweet 16 or Elite 8 or Final Four beyond this year, and Golden leaves for a blue blood, Florida should not be nibbling at unproven guys anymore, despite the fact that it would have presumably again worked out with Golden. But again, yeah. So if people just absolutely hated this part of the conversation, I really do apologize. I was certainly not trying to steer things away from a really good Florida basketball team. To me, talking about Golden getting hired by a blue blood is an extension of Florida having a really good basketball team. So I see this as an extension of a podcast where we have really talked about Florida being really good. And sorry to spring that one on you, Neil, but that's all I have today. And I've got to get to another meeting if you want to give your final thoughts and close us out.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That was a thing that we talked about. And we'll be back probably after these two games. I'll drop some Patreon preview about LSU tomorrow. Get into them just a little bit more. I don't think I'm going to do one on Georgia, but we might have some other stuff come up, I'm sure. Foss and I'll get to it. But that's it. Go Gators. Keep attacking closeouts.